Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Flight. Major General Jack Thompson, now in his late 60s, sat comfortably in the waiting lounge of the airport, his hands clasped together as he rested. His seasoned eyes, though worn with age and the weight of many years of service, retained a gleam of pride. The creases on his face told stories of battles fought, both physical and mental, and of triumphs that stretched far beyond the battlefield. Now retired, Jack's life was quieter. He had transitioned from commanding troops to commanding respect, and though the uniform had been replaced by civilian clothes, his presence still commanded attention wherever he went. Today was different. Today was special. Jack was heading to a ceremony in honor of his lifetime of service to the United States Army, a grand event designed to celebrate his contributions and to pay tribute to the generations of soldiers whose lives he had touched. A quiet man by nature, Jack wasn't one to seek accolades, but the recognition of his peers meant more to him than any of the medals he had earned. It was a sign that his life's work had mattered, that the sacrifices he had made were valued, and that the country he had served still remembered the price of freedom. His plane ticket had been upgraded to first class, a courtesy that came with his status and the fact that the airline had recognized his service. Jack rarely flew first class. In fact, he could count on one hand the number of times he had ever traveled in such luxury. As a man who spent most of his career on military transport planes, the lavish surroundings of a first-class cabin seemed almost foreign. But for today, he welcomed the comfort. As he boarded the plane, he was met with a polite but distant greeting from the flight attendants. His eyes scanned the cabin, taking in the plush seats and the luxurious interior of the aircraft. He found his seat, a window spot near the front of the plane, and settled into the plush chair. It was an unassuming seat for a man of his stature, but it would do. Jack wasn't one to demand attention. He had spent most of his life leading by example, letting his actions speak louder than any words ever could. Minutes later, the flight attendants began their rounds, offering pre-flight drinks and making small talk with the passengers. One flight attendant in particular, a young woman named Sarah Walker, walked toward him. Sarah was in her mid-20s, with a bright smile and a seemingly boundless energy. She had been with the airline for just over a year, and her youth and enthusiasm were evident in every movement she made. She was proud of the work she did, and she believed in the importance of providing exceptional service to her passengers. As Sarah approached Jack's seat, she gave him a polite but somewhat perfunctory greeting. "Good afternoon, sir. Would you like something to drink before we take off?" she asked, her voice light but lacking the warmth that Jack had come to expect from those in the service industry. Jack smiled and nodded politely. "A glass of water would be great, thank you," he replied, his deep voice carrying the calm confidence that came from years of leadership. Sarah, however, barely acknowledged his response. Her eyes flicked over Jack briefly, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor as she began to assess him more closely. She wasn't accustomed to seeing elderly men in first class, especially not ones who didn't seem to fit the usual profile of wealthy, business travelers. Jack, in his casual clothes, looked less like a distinguished military veteran and more like an old man who had somehow found his way into the wrong part of the plane. She hesitated for a moment, as if trying to reconcile the disheveled appearance of the man in front of her with the seat he occupied. A frown tugged at the corners of her lips. She could tell he wasn't a businessman. She could tell he wasn't one of those affluent first-class passengers she was used to serving. Maybe, she thought, he had gotten an upgrade by mistake. She handed him his water, her smile now a little more forced. "I'll be back shortly to collect your cup, sir," she said, already turning away. But Jack, ever the professional, didn't miss the subtle judgment in her eyes. It wasn't blatant, but it was there. He had seen it before, more times than he could count, especially in the years after his retirement. People made assumptions about him based on his age, his appearance, and his race. They assumed that because he was a black man of a certain age, he must not belong in spaces like first class. They thought him out of place in a world that still clung to outdated stereotypes. Jack didn't let it bother him. He had learned long ago that he couldn't control the prejudices of others, but he could control his own response. He chose not to engage with it, to rise above it, and to keep his focus on what mattered: his family, his service, and his own sense of pride. But as the flight progressed, Sarah's behavior became harder to ignore. She avoided making eye contact with him, giving him the bare minimum of attention, and failed to offer him the level of service he had seen given to other first-class passengers. It wasn't overtly rude, but it was dismissive in a way that felt personal. Jack had seen this type of behavior before, the subtle microaggressions that were often disguised as politeness but were unmistakable in their intent. It wasn't long before Sarah approached again, this time with the intention of making a further judgment. Jack noticed that the woman's gaze dropped as she neared his seat. He could tell she was trying to avoid any further engagement, likely uncomfortable with her assumptions being challenged. But before he could say anything, she spoke, her tone sharper than before. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice lacking warmth, "but I'm afraid you'll need to move to the back of the plane. This seat was meant for someone else. There's been a mistake." Jack's eyebrows rose in surprise. He was used to being treated with a certain level of respect, especially in first class. This wasn't the treatment he expected, and he could tell Sarah wasn't simply doing her job. This was something more. "Is there a problem with the seat?" Jack asked, his voice calm, but his patience beginning to wear thin. "I'm afraid so," Sarah replied, her face barely concealing her discomfort. "It's just that, well, this seat was meant for a higher priority passenger." Jack's mind raced as he processed her words. Higher priority passenger? Was she saying that because of his age, or because of something else? He wasn't sure, but he was certain that something about the situation felt off. "I'm afraid I'm going to need to ask you to move," Sarah insisted, a faint edge creeping into her voice. For a moment, Jack simply stared at her, his calm demeanor giving way to a growing sense of frustration. He knew what was happening here. This wasn't a case of simple confusion, it was something far more insidious. As Jack stood up, preparing to leave the seat that had been assigned to him, he noticed something in the corner of his eye. Another flight attendant, a more seasoned woman who had been observing the exchange, had noticed the confrontation and was making her way down the aisle. Her presence was enough to bring Sarah's actions to a halt. The seasoned flight attendant gave Jack a polite nod, signaling that she would handle the situation from here. Jack hesitated for a moment longer, his heart heavy with the weight of the situation. It wasn't just about the seat or the flight, it was about the principle of respect, and how often that was denied based on assumptions about who someone was. The flight attendant's actions had struck a nerve, but Jack wasn't the type to lash out. He simply nodded, his gaze briefly meeting the other attendants. "I'll be fine," Jack said, his voice steady. "I'll make sure this is handled properly." Little did Jack know, this would be a turning point in the flight, a moment that would not only change the trajectory of his journey but would also reveal the true character of those around him. As the flight continued its course, the tension between Jack Thompson and the young flight attendant, Sarah Walker, lingered in the air. Jack, having been a man of discipline all his life, understood that these moments of frustration, while seemingly small, could often lead to bigger lessons in the grand scheme of things. It was not the first time he had been treated unfairly in his life, and though his patience was being tested, he had learned long ago not to let anger or indignation cloud his better judgment. Still, the sting of that encounter remained with him, gnawing at him, as if the silent but palpable tension in the cabin had become a reflection of the subtle prejudices of the world outside. In the row ahead, a middle-aged couple sat quietly, engrossed in a conversation. They had witnessed the exchange, but neither of them had said anything. Sarah, the flight attendant, had walked away in haste, leaving the seasoned attendant to deal with the matter. Jack's calm yet dignified stance had seemingly caused a ripple effect among the passengers, who now exchanged glances. It was evident to Jack that Sarah had made a judgment call about him based on his appearance, something that he knew all too well was all too often a factor in how people were treated. A quiet, resentful sigh left his lips as he gazed out of the window. He couldn't help but wonder if this was a feeling he would ever fully escape, despite the many years of service to his country and his commitment to the ideals of duty and honor. The young flight attendant, Sarah, however, had already moved on, but not without a trace of discomfort. She hurried down the aisle, trying to focus on the tasks at hand, but her mind kept returning to the elderly man she had just interacted with. She was aware, perhaps unconsciously, that something had gone wrong. This wasn't just a customer service issue, it was about something deeper, a reflection of her own assumptions and biases. Sarah had been taught to serve with kindness and respect, to be attentive to the needs of all passengers regardless of who they were. But in that moment, she had allowed her own preconceived notions to cloud her judgment. She had seen an elderly black man in first class, someone who didn't quite fit the profile of the passengers she was used to serving. And without giving it a second thought, she had acted out of her discomfort, pushing Jack into a corner with an attitude that seemed more based on her own biases than on actual facts. For Sarah, the unease grew as she continued her duties. The seasoned attendant, an older woman named Helen, took over the situation with Jack. Helen had seen it all before, and her years of experience had taught her how to read the subtleties of passenger interactions. She approached Jack with grace and professionalism, a stark contrast to the younger attendant's hurried and nervous approach. Helen's voice was calm, and her demeanor was poised as she addressed Jack's concerns. "I apologize for the misunderstanding, sir," she said, her tone sincere. "I'll make sure everything is sorted out immediately." Jack looked up at her, the lines of his face softening. He appreciated the change in approach, the acknowledgement of the problem, even though it didn't erase the frustration he had already experienced. "I understand," Jack replied, his voice steady, though there was an edge to it. "I just don't understand why I was treated that way. I've flown for years, and I've never had an issue in first class." Helen nodded, her expression reflecting understanding. She had seen this kind of thing before. People who didn't quite belong to the exclusive world of first-class travelers, or at least that's how it appeared to some. The truth, however, was far different. Jack Thompson was no ordinary passenger. His experience in the Army had earned him respect from his peers, and his contribution to his country had earned him a place in the annals of history. But to Sarah, and perhaps to many others, he was just another elderly man, trying to make his way through a world that didn't always understand him. "We'll take care of everything, sir," Helen assured him. "I'll personally make sure your comfort is our priority for the remainder of the flight. Please don't hesitate to let me know if you need anything." Jack gave a tight smile, grateful for Helen's professionalism. "Thank you," he said, offering her a nod of acknowledgement. As Helen walked away, Jack leaned back in his seat, his thoughts swirling. He had fought battles on foreign soil, he had been through the turmoil of war, and yet, here he was, facing a far more insidious enemy, prejudice. It wasn't the kind of enemy you could see, but it was one that left scars all the same. It was a silent force, a subtle whisper that followed him wherever he went, one that assumed things about him based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the age he had reached. In many ways, this was the fight that had lingered long after the physical battles had ended. It was the fight he still fought, even in retirement. The flight progressed, and Jack tried to settle into his thoughts. The hum of the plane's engines was comforting, a reminder that he was moving forward, regardless of the obstacles in his path. But the incident with Sarah kept resurfacing in his mind. He had lived a life where respect had been earned, where merit mattered far more than appearance, yet here, in the supposed comfort of first class, he had been treated as though he didn't belong. Meanwhile, Sarah was struggling with her own inner turmoil. She couldn't shake the image of Jack's face from her mind. His calm demeanor in the face of her rude behavior had left her feeling uneasy, and as she passed by him again, she couldn't help but steal a glance at the elderly man in the window seat. There was something about him that felt different now, something she couldn't quite place. She had made a quick judgment, and now it seemed like that judgment was starting to unravel in front of her eyes. What if she had been wrong? What if Jack wasn't just some old man who didn't belong in first class? What if he was someone of significance, someone whose presence deserved not just respect, but gratitude? As the flight neared its cruising altitude, Sarah found herself wrestling with an uncomfortable truth. She had made assumptions about Jack based on his appearance, and in doing so, she had disrespected him. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how wrong she had been. The discomfort she felt wasn't just because she had treated a passenger poorly, it was because she had allowed herself to fall into the trap of prejudice, a trap she had been taught to avoid but had, in that moment, willingly stepped into. She glanced over at Jack once more, but this time, her gaze lingered longer. She saw the distinguished lines of his face, the silent strength that radiated from him, and something clicked in her mind. Jack wasn't just an ordinary elderly man, he was someone who had lived a life of purpose, a life that had shaped the world in ways she could never fully comprehend. He had been a leader, a general, someone who had commanded armies and earned the respect of his nation. And here she was, a young flight attendant, judging him based on nothing more than his appearance. The thought hit her hard. How many times had she made similar assumptions about other people in her life? How many times had she dismissed someone based on their appearance, their age, or their race? The realization was a painful one, and it stung her to the core. But Sarah was determined to make it right. She couldn't undo the harm she had caused, but she could at least try to fix the situation. With a deep breath, she walked toward the cockpit area, her heart racing. She needed to speak with her manager. She needed to do something that would show Jack that his dignity was important, that he was respected, no matter what assumptions had been made. As Sarah made her way down the aisle, she resolved to take responsibility for her actions, to acknowledge her mistakes, and to make amends. She didn't know if Jack would accept her apology, but she was determined to try. Meanwhile, Jack sat in silence, watching the clouds pass by as the plane sailed smoothly through the skies. His mind was far from the incident with Sarah now. It wasn't because he had let it go, he never let things like that go, but because the weight of his years had taught him that, sometimes, the best way to face prejudice and disrespect was simply to rise above it. And as he looked out over the vast expanse of sky before him, he realized that, in the end, his worth wasn't defined by the judgments of others. It was defined by what he had done, what he had given, and how he had lived his life. And while Sarah was on her way to confront her own mistakes, Jack had already found his peace. As the flight continued, the tension between the passengers and the events that had unfolded lingered like an undercurrent, unnoticed by many, but deeply felt by a few. Jack Thompson, a man who had witnessed the horrors of war and the intricate dance of diplomacy, could not shake the discomfort that had settled in his heart. The quiet hum of the plane, the smooth rhythm of its ascent into the skies, did little to dull the sharpness of the confrontation he had endured. Jack's life, filled with experience and reflection, had led him to an understanding that far too many others had yet to grasp. The world didn't owe you respect just because you had earned it, it was something you had to fight for every single day, sometimes in the most unexpected places. As Jack sat there, his eyes fixed on the window, the memories of his military career flashed before him. He had fought for freedom, for the right of others to live without fear, and for a country he had always believed in. But these ideals, these values that he had spent so much of his life defending, were sometimes hard to see reflected in the everyday interactions of ordinary citizens. He had seen it all, racism, injustice, and prejudice, sometimes from unexpected sources. What had happened on this flight was just another reminder that the battle for equality was far from over. But Jack, ever the soldier, knew how to compartmentalize his emotions. He had long since learned how to push through the hardest of days, how to keep his composure in the face of adversity. He would rise above this, just as he had risen above so many challenges before. What Jack did not know was that the young flight attendant, Sarah Walker, was experiencing a moment of deep reflection herself. As the flight continued its course, Sarah's internal battle raged on. She had always prided herself on her ability to be kind, to be the type of person who would go above and beyond for others. But today, she had failed in her most basic duty, treating everyone with dignity and respect. Her actions had been driven by assumptions, by unconscious biases she hadn't even known existed within her. She couldn't help but replay the moment over and over in her mind, the moment when she had looked at Jack and, without a second thought, made a judgment about him. She had seen an elderly black man in first class, and something inside her had clicked. Her mind had drawn conclusions that, in hindsight, seemed absurd, but in the moment, they felt all too real. He didn't belong in first class, or at least that's what she had thought. She had allowed her discomfort to dictate her behavior, and now, as the reality of her actions settled in, she felt a pang of regret deep in her chest. Sarah had been raised to treat everyone equally. Her parents, her teachers, her mentors, had all taught her that no one should be judged based on their appearance, their race, or their age. But somehow, in that moment, she had forgotten everything she had been taught. It wasn't just about a mistake in customer service, it was about a deeper failure, one that struck at the very heart of who she was as a person. She had allowed prejudice to take root, even if it was just for a fleeting moment, and the guilt was heavy. After the interaction with Jack, Sarah had tried to busy herself with the tasks of the flight. She had gone through the motions, attending to the other passengers, serving drinks, and offering assistance. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on the work in front of her, her mind kept returning to Jack. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at her, his calm demeanor and the quiet dignity in his eyes. She had seen it before, veterans carried that kind of presence with them. It was a strength born from experience, from living through the worst and coming out the other side, unbroken. But she had seen something else too, something she hadn't been able to fully grasp at the time. There had been a moment when Jack's gaze had softened, a flicker of understanding and resignation in his eyes, as if he had known exactly what had just happened. And that realization made Sarah's heart ache. She had heard stories about veterans, about the sacrifices they made, the burdens they carried, and the struggles they faced long after they had served. But this was different. This wasn't just another story. This was a man sitting right in front of her, a man who had likely seen things she could never imagine, and yet, here he was, showing restraint and patience in the face of her own ignorance. It was humbling, and it made her feel small in ways she had never experienced before. Helen, the seasoned flight attendant who had taken over the situation with Jack, had noticed the shift in Sarah's demeanor. Helen was the type of person who could read people well. She had been a flight attendant for over 20 years, and in that time, she had seen countless interactions, some of which were filled with kindness, and others filled with tension. She knew when something was off, and when she had seen Sarah's behavior towards Jack, she had known that there was more to the situation than met the eye. After a few minutes, Helen approached Sarah, her expression kind but firm. "Hey, are you all right?" she asked, her voice low enough that it wouldn't draw attention from the passengers. Sarah, startled by the question, turned her gaze to her colleague. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. The weight of what she had done felt too heavy to share, and the shame she felt seemed almost unbearable. But Helen's gentle inquiry broke through her wall of self-doubt. Sarah had been working alongside Helen long enough to know that she was someone who understood, someone who had seen it all and would never judge. "I messed up," Sarah finally admitted, her voice cracking. I treated him wrong. I made assumptions about him, and I shouldn't have. I don't even know why I did it. I saw an elderly man in first class, and I thought he didn't belong there. I thought maybe he was in the wrong seat. And now I can't stop thinking about it. I feel so bad, Helen." Helen listened quietly, her expression one of compassion. She had seen this kind of thing before, someone making a mistake, coming to terms with it, and struggling with the guilt. It was part of life, part of the human experience. But the key, as Helen knew, was in how you responded to that moment. The only way to move forward was to face it head-on and take responsibility for your actions. "You're not the only one who's ever made a mistake, Sarah," Helen said, her voice warm but steady. "But the most important thing is that you recognize it, and you learn from it. We all have our moments of weakness, but the best thing you can do is own up to it, and do better next time. Jack is a good man. I'm sure he'll understand. You just need to go to him and apologize, genuinely. That's all you can do now." Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't going to be easy, but Helen's words gave her the courage she needed. She didn't know if Jack would accept her apology, but at least she could try. And maybe, just maybe, it would be a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. With a deep breath, Sarah straightened her back and made her way down the aisle toward Jack's seat. As she approached, she saw the man staring out of the window, lost in thought. For a moment, she hesitated. What could she possibly say to him? How could she make up for the hurt she had caused? But then she remembered Helen's words, apologize genuinely. That was all she could do. Excuse me, sir, Sarah said softly as she reached his seat. Jack turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting hers. He didn't look angry, but there was a quiet sadness in his eyes. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment. Jack, I owe you an apology, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. I treated you poorly earlier, and I made assumptions about you that were completely wrong. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have judged you based on how you looked. You deserve respect, and I failed to give that to you. I really regret my actions, and I just wanted to let you know how sorry I am. For a long moment, Jack said nothing. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Sarah's heart raced, but she stood there, waiting for his response. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice calm and steady, like the man he was. Thank you, he said, his words simple but full of meaning. Apologies are not always easy to offer, but they are the first step in making things right. And you've done that, young lady. A sense of relief washed over Sarah, and she gave a small nod. I'll do better, she promised, her voice steady now. I will. Jack offered a small smile, one that was quiet but genuine. That's all anyone can do, he said. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we move forward. With that, Sarah returned to her duties, feeling a weight lifted from her shoulders. The rest of the flight passed without incident, but for both Sarah and Jack, it had been a journey of personal growth, one that neither of them would soon forget. The rest of the flight seemed to pass in a blur for both Sarah and Jack, but it was a blur of quiet transformation, a quiet reckoning with their past actions and a subtle, but important, moment of growth. Sarah continued to go about her duties, but she moved with a newfound sense of awareness, each interaction with the passengers now colored by the reflection on her own actions earlier. Every smile she offered, every glass of water she handed out, now felt more genuine, more intentional. There was a tenderness to her service now, a softness that hadn't been there before, as if she was trying to make up for the small injustice she had imposed on Jack. She caught herself looking at people differently now, questioning those quick assumptions, examining her biases that she had never thought to address. The guilt was still there, but it no longer felt like a burden she had to carry alone. It was the beginning of something new inside her, a quiet resolve to never let such a thing happen again. Jack, on the other hand, sat quietly in his seat, his gaze often drifting back to the window. There was a weight to his thoughts now, a mixture of resignation and peace that seemed to coexist in the way he observed the world. His calm demeanor had never been more present than it was now, and though the frustration from earlier was still with him, it no longer felt like an active fight. It was more like an acknowledgement of the realities of life, realities he had come to understand over decades of service, of sacrifice, and of quietly pushing through the barriers that others imposed on him. Jack had learned that, sometimes, in the face of ignorance and prejudice, the best thing one could do was to remain steadfast, to never allow oneself to be defined by the limitations that others sought to impose. And in that quiet moment, in the midst of the plane's hum and the rustling of papers and the sounds of flight attendants walking down the aisles, Jack realized that Sarah had learned something important too. She had learned that respect, true respect, had to be earned, and sometimes, that lesson came at the expense of discomfort and humility. The plane continued its journey across the sky, and the captain's voice broke through the hum of the cabin, announcing the descent into the destination city. The atmosphere aboard the flight seemed to shift as the passengers began to prepare for landing, unbuckling their seatbelts, gathering their belongings, and adjusting to the change in altitude. Sarah went through the motions of preparing the cabin for landing, moving swiftly yet carefully, attending to each passenger with a quiet grace that hadn't been there at the start of the flight. It wasn't just a service she was providing anymore, it was a gesture of respect. Every action felt deliberate, thought out. It was as if she was reminding herself, with every task, to treat each individual with the care they deserved, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. For Jack, the descent was symbolic. He had made peace with the situation, understanding that people, for better or worse, carried their own biases and judgments. His own experience had shaped him to accept that this would always be a part of his life, the assumptions, the subtle discrimination, and the quick judgments. But today had been different. He had seen the potential for growth in others, even in the young flight attendant who had shown him a moment of disrespect. She had learned. She had apologized. And in doing so, she had taken a small, yet significant step toward becoming the kind of person who would never make such a mistake again. That was the thing about growth, Jack thought. It wasn't about perfection, but about the ability to acknowledge your mistakes and work toward doing better. And in that respect, Sarah had done something brave, something many people never do. She had faced herself and taken responsibility. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Jack stood slowly, stretching his legs and preparing to leave the cabin. He felt a sense of quiet gratitude, not just for the destination he had arrived at, but for the unexpected lessons learned along the way. He had flown thousands of miles, fought battles on foreign lands, and commanded soldiers in the heat of combat, but it was in this simple interaction on a plane that he had found a reminder of what truly mattered in life: respect, humility, and the ability to see each person for who they truly were. As Jack made his way down the aisle, he passed Sarah, who was now assisting a few other passengers with their belongings. He couldn't help but notice the subtle difference in her demeanor. There was a sense of maturity in the way she carried herself now, the depth to her that hadn't been there before. As he reached the front of the plane, Jack paused for a moment, turning to Sarah. She looked up at him, and for the first time since the incident earlier, their eyes met with understanding, without the veil of discomfort or judgment that had hung between them. She smiled faintly, a soft, apologetic smile that spoke volumes. Jack offered a small nod, his lips curving upward in a gesture of acknowledgement. In that fleeting moment, there was no need for words. They had both understood each other without needing to say anything else. "Take care," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of everything unspoken. Sarah nodded in return, her smile deepening just slightly. "You too," she replied, her voice sincere. With that, Jack stepped off the plane, his step steady, his heart lighter. He knew that the world would continue to present him with challenges, but for now, he felt a sense of peace that came from knowing that respect, though hard won, was something he had fought for, and something that, in this small, unexpected interaction, had been acknowledged. As Sarah watched him disappear down the jet bridge, she stood still for a moment, the weight of the experience sinking in. She had made a mistake, a big one, but it wasn't the mistake itself that defined her, it was how she responded to it. She had taken responsibility. She had apologized. And she had learned. In the years to come, Sarah would carry that lesson with her, carrying it into her work, into her personal life, and into the way she saw the world. Every person, no matter their background or appearance, deserved the same respect. No exceptions. The next time she encountered someone like Jack, or anyone, for that matter, she would remember the quiet dignity of the man she had misjudged and treat them with the care and respect they deserved, without hesitation. The lesson had been painful, but it had been a lesson that would stay with her forever. And though it had taken an uncomfortable confrontation, a misstep, and a moment of reflection, it had led to something beautiful: growth, humility, and an understanding of the deep, often invisible, ways in which we all are connected. As she walked away, Sarah found herself silently grateful for the unexpected opportunity to learn, to make amends, and to become a better version of herself. In the end, that was the true power of the moment, the power to change, to grow, and to understand that we all have a part to play in making the world a more respectful and compassionate place for everyone. The days that followed Jack Thompson's flight were marked by an unusual sense of quiet reflection. For Jack, the incident was now part of his past, a chapter in his long life that was already written, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the moment had offered more than just a fleeting lesson, it had been a catalyst for something deeper. The world outside, with its complex history and ongoing struggles, had a way of sneaking into the quietest of moments, and today's experience had left an indelible mark on him. He had lived a lifetime of service, dedication, and sacrifice, yet even now, in his retirement, he was reminded that every day was a new opportunity to shape how he interacted with the world. Jack spent much of his retirement quietly. He had found solace in the stillness of his home, in the company of his family, and in the occasional trips to visit old comrades. But even in his retirement, Jack remained vigilant about the things that truly mattered: honor, dignity, and the importance of leading with respect for others. He had never sought recognition for the work he had done for his country, and he had always believed that true leadership wasn't about titles or medals, it was about how you treated the people around you, regardless of who they were. The day after the flight, Jack received a letter. It was a small gesture, but one that carried a weight far heavier than its simplicity. The envelope, white and unassuming, had been hand-delivered to his home, its contents carefully crafted. As Jack read through the letter, he recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Sarah's. He hadn't expected to hear from her again. The events of the flight had, in some ways, felt like a closed chapter, but Sarah's letter proved that there was more to be learned from the experience. Her words were simple, yet filled with sincerity, as if each sentence had been written with a deep understanding of the significance of what had transpired. Dear Major General Thompson, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to take the time to personally thank you for your kindness and your understanding on the flight. I know that I made a mistake, and I deeply regret how I treated you. I'm ashamed of how quickly I made assumptions about you based on how you looked, and I am so sorry for that. Since that day, I've thought a lot about what happened, and it's made me realize how often we, as people, fall into patterns of judgment without even thinking about it. I want you to know that I've taken this lesson to heart. I will never forget the way you handled the situation with grace and dignity, and it has inspired me to be more aware of my own biases and assumptions. It's something I'm actively working on, and I hope to be a better person for it. Thank you for being patient with me and for teaching me in a way that I will never forget. I truly hope that, despite the way I treated you, you were still able to have a pleasant flight and enjoy your time. With deepest respect, Sarah Walker. Jack folded the letter slowly, a soft smile crossing his face. The words, though humble and sincere, carried a weight far greater than the formality of an apology. They spoke of a genuine effort to learn, to change, and to become better. In that moment, Jack felt a quiet pride for Sarah, not because of the apology itself, but because of the self-awareness she had gained. It was one thing to recognize a mistake, it was another to take full responsibility and actively work to be a better version of oneself. Sarah had done that, and for that, Jack admired her. It was rare for Jack to feel such a strong connection to someone, especially someone so much younger than him, and yet, in Sarah's words, he recognized a shared humanity, a recognition of our imperfections and the desire to overcome them. Jack understood that life wasn't about being perfect, it was about growing, learning, and striving to be better. Every day was a new chance to face our flaws and push through them. Sarah's letter, written with such thoughtfulness and care, reminded him of that truth. Over the following weeks, Jack found himself thinking about Sarah more often than he would have expected. It was as if the brief encounter had opened a door in his mind, one that led to a broader reflection on the world around him. He began to consider how often he had encountered prejudice throughout his life, how many times he had seen others treated unfairly because of their appearance, their race, or their background. But what stuck with him most was the realization that it wasn't enough to just be aware of these injustices, it was about how one responded to them. Jack's thoughts turned to his own experiences in the military. There had been countless moments when he had witnessed the same biases and assumptions that Sarah had exhibited. He had faced racism himself, and he had seen others suffer under the weight of discrimination. But he had also witnessed moments of profound change, moments where people rose above their limitations and learned to treat others with the respect they deserved. He thought of the soldiers he had commanded, many of whom had come from all walks of life. They had been young, old, black, white, men, women, each of them different in so many ways, yet they had all been united by one common goal: to serve their country with honor. And in that shared mission, they had learned to see each other as comrades, as brothers and sisters, rather than as labels. It was the true essence of leadership, creating an environment where people could see beyond their differences and work together toward a common purpose. Jack's mind also drifted to his own children, who were now adults with families of their own. He had raised them to understand the importance of respect and empathy. He had instilled in them the idea that they were part of a larger world, one that required compassion and understanding in order to thrive. Jack had always believed that teaching those values was the most important thck he could do as a father, and as he reflected on the events with Sarah, he realized that his own children had learned from his example, just as Sarah had learned from her own experience. It was a ripple effect, a passing of wisdom from one generation to the next, from one person to another. Back at work, Sarah too had been undergoing her own quiet transformation. She had never expected such a simple interaction to change the way she viewed the world, but in the weeks following the flight, she found herself more aware of the way she saw others. She started paying closer attention to the way people interacted with each other, noticing the small moments of judgment, the assumptions that were often made in the blink of an eye. It wasn't easy to confront the biases she had carried with her, but the journey had begun. Every day, she made a conscious effort to challenge her own thoughts, to pause before making assumptions, and to treat people with more patience and understanding. One afternoon, as Sarah was finishing her shift, she found herself walking past a group of passengers waiting for their flight. She overheard one woman whispering to her friend, making a comment about a man standing nearby. Without even thinking, Sarah stepped forward, offering a soft smile to the woman. "Excuse me," she said gently, "but we shouldn't make assumptions about people based on how they look. Everyone has their own story, their own experiences." The woman blinked, taken aback by Sarah's sudden intervention, but Sarah's calm demeanor left no room for argument. "Just something to think about," Sarah added, before walking away. The exchange was small, almost insignificant, but it felt like a victory to Sarah. It was a reminder that change didn't always have to come in grand gestures. Sometimes, it was the small, quiet moments that made the biggest difference. Weeks passed, and though the incident on the flight was now behind them, the lessons it had imparted continued to shape both Jack and Sarah. The world had a way of presenting challenges, of forcing people to confront their own limitations, but it also had a way of offering redemption, if one was willing to accept it. Both Jack and Sarah had learned that humility, patience, and understanding were not just ideals to be talked about, they were actions that had to be practiced daily. And in doing so, they had begun the process of transforming not only themselves, but also the world around them. One evening, Jack received another letter, this one from Sarah's supervisor at the airline. The letter was brief but filled with gratitude. It acknowledged the professionalism and grace that Jack had displayed on the flight and noted that Sarah had undergone additional training to improve her customer service skills and address unconscious biases. It wasn't the letter itself that mattered to Jack, but the fact that Sarah's actions had led to real change. She had learned, she had grown, and in doing so, she had passed on the lesson to others. Jack smiled as he placed the letter on his desk. He knew that Sarah's journey was far from over, but in his heart, he knew that she was on the right path. And as for Jack, he too had learned something in this experience. It wasn't just about standing up to prejudice or dealing with small injustices, it was about the quiet power of humility, the power of making a difference not by force, but by example. Jack had seen it in Sarah, and in his own life, he had witnessed the power of small, everyday actions that had the potential to create lasting change. The flight had ended long ago, but the lessons from that brief encounter would stay with both of them, forever shaping the way they saw the world, and the way they chose to engage with it.